mentioned, I've been asked to look at the institutional issues around payments for ecosystem services, particularly as they apply to the Babiansgroep. And there's a lot of excitement about the idea of payment for ecosystem services and hope that it will generate the finances we need to maintain this restoration program in the long term. But at the same time, there's lots of concerns about it. And that's also reflected in a lot of the literature about payments for ecosystem services and the theory and how that diverges from practice and so forth. So some of those concerns relate to a worry that people have that a lot of our environmental and social problems have been created by the market. So now we want to create another market for ecosystem services. Is that really going to solve our problem? And at the same time, we also have, we're going to introduce this new payment system for ecosystem services in a context where all the other existing markets still remain. And they may not gel very well. The PAIR's theory is that our environmental problems are created by the fact that there are no markets for ecosystem services. So our solution is supposedly to create those markets and to make property rights and make it possible for people to trade in ecosystem services. But the assumption is often that these markets can operate in the same way as they have always operated in the past, in a very individualistic way, and that should produce the right outcomes. But there are some concerns about whether it will actually produce that result. So I want to look at the Babiansgroep and some of the characteristics of that area and see whether it can produce it or whether there might be some problems with the way it's introduced. So, okay, I'm going to argue that the outcomes will depend on the local context and the distribution of assets and resources within that area. Now, one of the key characteristics of that area is that there's a very uneven distribution in terms of ownership of land that's degraded. So, as a result of that, there would be a very uneven distribution of the way in which people, or particular landowners, could benefit from a payment system, for example, on the carbon. So, for example, one of the farmers has an area of more than 4,000 hectares that is degraded and could be revegetated, and that amounts to 36% of all the degraded land in that valley. So, and then there are a couple of other farmers who've also got large chunks of land which are degraded, and then there are many more farmers at the bottom end of the scale who have very small farms. Also has some degraded land, but much less. Okay, so let's have a look at what happens then if we introduce a payment scheme for carbon, for example, to start with. And we assume that people behave in a very traditional way that people behave in markets, in a very individualistic way. I would expect under those kind of assumptions that carbon brokers will tend to target the largest farmers. Okay. Because the transaction costs will be much lower, so they'll be able to be more efficient and make more money. So they're going to enter into individual contracts with those targeted farmers. So if that occurs, what's going to happen? In terms of environmental outcomes, those brokers are likely to target less than 15% or 4 or less farmers in that area. That would result in less than 60% of the degraded land being targeted for revegetation. And most of the rest of the land would be ignored. And then in terms of the potential to generate ecosystem services related to water, those would also be reduced because the area of land revegetated would be lower. Then if you look at the social outcomes, so again we have very few farmers farmers benefiting, and mostly the large farmers. Many of the other farmers in that area who are struggling are likely to go out of business and have to sell up and move to other areas. In the long term, we might have some consolidation of land, particularly if those people who are benefiting from schemes buy up that land from other people, or if the conservation authorities buy the land. So that might be a benefit for the environment, but not necessarily a social benefit. Now, one of the other big benefits of a revegetation scheme and a carbon scheme that Krista alluded to is this issue of employment creation. And obviously, how much employment is created will depend on what area is, how much land is revegetated, and how quickly it's revegetated using what labor. So I tried to develop some estimates just to, as a hypothetical example, to try and look at what might happen in the Baviance Kloof. And I used this information from the authorities, from their experience of how much effort it takes to actually revegetate a piece of land. Okay, so using that data and using the spatial data for the Baviance Kloof, these are our options. If we revegetate all the land, okay, 100% of it, using just the local labor, there are around about 120 households, poor households in that area who would probably be prepared to work on this kind of thing. It would take them 10 years, 10 and a half years to revegetate that area. If you import labor, then you could do it in 5 to 3 years. That's revegetating everything. But if we assume under this traditional, the way people traditionally behave in markets, and that the brokers target just the largest farmers and try and do it as quickly as possible in order to minimize the costs and maximize the profits, then we're likely to be left in this kind of square here, where it will take 1 to 3 years to revegetate the area, and it will be mostly, or at least half of that labor would be derived from outside of the region. Okay. So under this individualistic scenario, okay, if we get 120 people, local people employed in that program, that would be good job opportunities for them, but it would also have a negative effect probably on some of the existing employment opportunities in there. For example, for tourism and other agricultural activities, possibly even for conservation as well. Okay, the other problem with going with this scenario is that there's a very short period within which people get employment. It would also require a lot of in-migration, and that might create some social tensions as well. Okay. And in the long term, it could undermine the sustainability of local livelihoods and result in rural-urban migration. And that increases our problems in the urban areas, where we have water shortages, we have poverty, we have unemployment. So we're basically just, by creating this payment scheme based on those kind of behaviors, we're exacerbating the environmental problems in other areas. Okay, so if we want to introduce pay schemes, and we want to make sure we produce optimal environmental and social outcomes, then we need to think about doing things a bit differently and creating incentives for collective cooperation. So under that kind of scheme, we could potentially revegetate all the degraded land and focus on using local labor only. And that would ensure that there would be full employment for local people for at least 10 years, but probably for longer.